So your duty under any circumstances is to behave in such a way that the client thinks he's the smartest person in the world. And you've got any little energy or insight available after that, use it to make your senior partner look like the smartest person in the world. And only after you've satisfied those two obligations do you want your light to shine at all. Well, that may have been very good advice for rising in a large firm. It wasn't what I did. I always obeyed the drift of my nature, and if other people didn't like it, well, I didn't need to be adored by everybody. Another idea, and by the way, when I talk about this multidisciplinary attitude, I'm really following a very key idea of the greatest lawyer of antiquity, Marcus Tullus Cicero. And Cicero is famous for saying, a man who doesn't know what happened before he's born goes through life like a child. Now, that is a very correct idea of Cicero's, and he's right to ridicule somebody so foolish as not to know what happened before he was born. But if you generalize Cicero, as I think one should, there are all these other things that you should know in addition to history. And those other things are the big ideas in all the other disciplines. And it doesn't help you just to know them enough so you could prattle them back on an exam and get an A. You have to learn these things in such a way that they're in a mental lattice work in your head and you automatically use them for the rest of your life. If you do that, I solemnly promise you that one day you'll be walking down the street and you'll look to your right and left and you'll think, my heavenly days, I'm now one of the few most competent people of my whole age cohort. If you don't do it, many of the brightest of you will live in the middle ranks or in the shallows. Another idea that I got, and it was encapsulated by that story the dean recounted about the man who wanted to know where he was going to die and he wouldn't go there. That rustic who had that idea had a profound truth in his hand. The way complex adaptive systems work and the way mental constructs work, problems frequently get easy. I'd even say usually are easier to solve if you turn them around in reverse. In other words, if you want to help India, the question you should ask is now, how can I help India? You think, what's doing the worst damage in India? What will automatically do the worst damage, and how do I avoid it? You'd think they're logically the same thing. They're not. Those of you who have mastered algebra know that inversion frequently will solve problems which nothing else will solve. And in life, unless you're more gifted than Einstein, inversion will help you solve problems that you can't solve another way. Let me use a little inversion now. What will really fail in life? What do we want to avoid? Such an easy answer. Sloth and unreliability. If you're unreliable, it doesn't matter what your virtues are. You're going to crater immediately. So doing what you have faithfully engaged to do should be an automatic part of your conduct. You want to avoid sloth and unreliability. Another thing I think should be avoided is extremely intense ideology, because it cabbages up one's mind. You've seen that, and you see a lot of it, in TV preachers, for instance. They've all got different ideas about theology, and a lot of them have minds that are made of cabbage. But that can happen with political ideology. And if you're young, it's easy to drift into loyalties. And when you announce that you're a loyal member and you start shouting the orthodox ideology out, what you're doing is pounding it in. And you're gradually ruining your mind. So you want to be very, very careful with this ideology. It's a big danger. in my mind, I've got a little example I use whenever I think about ideology, and that's these Scandinavian canoeists who succeeded in taming all the rapids of Scandinavia, and they thought they would tackle the whirlpools of the Erin Rapids here in the United States. The death rate was 100%. A big whirlpool is not something you want to go into. And I think the same is true about a really deep ideology. I have what I call an iron prescription that helps me keep sane when I naturally drift toward preferring one ideology over another. And that is, I say, I'm not entitled to have an opinion on this subject unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people do who are supporting it. I think only when I've reached that state am I qualified to speak. Now you can say that's too much of an iron discipline. It's not too much of an iron discipline. It isn't even that hard to do. It sounds a lot like the iron prescription of Ferdinand the Great. It's not necessary to hope in order to persevere. That probably is too tough for most people. I don't think it's too tough for me, but it's too tough for most people. But this business of not drifting into the extreme ideology is a very, very important thing in life. If you want to have more correct knowledge and be wiser than other people, the heavy ideology is very likely to do you in. Another thing, of course, that does one in is the self-serving bias to which we're all subject. You think the true little me is entitled to do what it wants to do. And, for instance, why shouldn't the true little me overspend my income? Well, there once was a man who became the most famous composer in the world, but he was utterly miserable most of the time. And one of the reasons was he always overspent his income. That was Mozart. If Mozart can't get by with this kind of asinine conduct, I don't think you should try it. Generally speaking, envy, resentment, revenge, and self-pity are disastrous modes of thoughts. Self-pity gets pretty close to paranoia, and paranoia is one of the very hardest things to reverse. You do not want to drift into self-pity. I have a friend who carried a big stack of Lenin cards, about this thick, and when somebody would make a comment that reflected self-pity, he would take out one of the cards, take the top one off the stack, and hand it to the person. And the card said, "Your story has touched my heart. Never have I heard of anyone with as many misfortunes as you." Well, you can say that's waggery, but I suggest that every time you find you're drifting into self-pity, and I don't care what the cause, your child can be dying of cancer, self-pity is not going to improve the situation. Just give yourself one of those cards. It's a ridiculous way to behave. And when you avoid it, you get a great advantage over everybody else, almost everybody else, because self-pity is a standard condition. And yet you can train yourself out of it. And of course, the self-serving bias